The average survival time for a Soviet soldier arriving at Stalingrad in September 1942 was less than 24 hours. Not days, hours. Vasili Chuikov knew that number. He kept sending men across the Volga anyway, not because he didn't care about their lives, because he understood something that no military manual had ever articulated, something that contradicted every instinct of conventional defense. Every man who crossed that river and survived for even a few hours was a man the Germans had to spend time killing. And that time was the only resource that mattered. Chuikov had been given an order that should have been impossible. Defend Stalingrad with what remained of the 62nd Army. No reserves, no air cover, no defensive depth. The Volga River at his back. If the Germans crossed, the Soviet supply line through the most critical artery in Russia was gone. He studied the map for hours, and he arrived at a conclusion that no one in Moscow would have approved if he'd explained it in advance. The answer was not to build stronger positions. The answer was to get so close to the enemy that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without killing their own men. Zero distance, same buildings, sometimes the same staircase. What happened over the next 3 months at Stalingrad was not a conventional defense. It was the deliberate conversion of a destroyed city into a weapon, one that consumed the German 6th Army from the inside, while Zhukov prepared the trap that would close around it from the outside. This is the story of how Chuikov changed what it meant to defend a city, and why the decision cost 300,000 German lives and saved the Soviet Union. To understand what made Chuikov's approach at Stalingrad different from everything that came before it, you need to understand the geography of the city and why it made conventional defense not just difficult, but structurally impossible. Stalingrad in 1942 stretched along the western bank of the Volga for more than 25 miles, a narrow urban strip between the river and the hills to the west, with almost no strategic depth. The industrial sector in the north, centered on the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory and the Barakati steelworks, was exactly the kind of infrastructure the German army had been designed to destroy rapidly with air power and artillery, then occupy with infantry. The Luftwaffe's August 1942 bombing raid killed approximately 40,000 civilians in a single day and reduced large parts of the city to rubble. From a conventional military perspective, this was devastating. From Chuikov's perspective, it created something no pre-war planner had anticipated: the best possible defensive terrain for infantry at zero distance from the enemy. Rubble doesn't behave like intact urban terrain. It creates a maze of fragmented walls, flooded basements, collapsed corridors, and improvised sniper positions that can be held by a handful of men for days. Artillery impacts that would have cleared defenders from intact buildings were absorbed by the rubble, without the shockwave effect that made open ground positions untenable. The destruction of Stalingrad had accidentally created exactly the terrain that neutralized German air and armor superiority. Chuikov didn't just recognize this, he built an entire operational doctrine around it. By the peak of the battle, German advance in Stalingrad was measured in meters per day. Divisions arrived at the front at full strength and left weeks later at a third of their original composition. The 6th Army was losing between 3,000 and 4,000 men per week, in a city that covered less than 30 square miles. The Battle of Stalingrad consumed more German soldiers per square kilometer than any engagement on the Eastern Front. Vasili Chuikov arrived to take command of the 62nd Army on September 12, 1942, with a reputation that was, at best, mixed. He had commanded Soviet forces in the disastrous Finland campaign of 1939 to 1940, where the Red Army had suffered humiliating losses against a much smaller adversary. He had served as a military advisor in China. He was not a first-tier Soviet general in 1942. What he had was something the Soviet army desperately needed, and that no rank or academic training could substitute for: the willingness to make decisions that contradicted conventional thinking, when conventional thinking had demonstrably failed. His first decision was to move his command post to the bank of the Volga, less than 300 meters from the most advanced German positions. By every conventional criterion, this was operationally irrational. A command post that close to the front was vulnerable to sniper fire, artillery, and any local German advance. But it sent a message that every man in the 62nd Army understood immediately. The general had nowhere to retreat to. Nobody had anywhere to retreat to. The river was behind them. His second decision was to redesign the basic combat unit. Instead of battalions and regiments, formations that made sense in open terrain but were too large to maneuver and too visible to survive artillery in Stalingrad's rubble. Chuikov created assault groups of 6 to 8 men, armed with grenades, light machine guns, and knives, trained to move through buildings via holes knocked in walls, rather than through streets where German fire waited. These assault groups could move through the interior of a city block without ever entering open space. They could appear at positions the Germans hadn't covered because nobody expected anyone to arrive from that direction. They could attack at night, using the terrain knowledge that survivors accumulated over days of staying alive. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, whose small unit held an apartment building in central Stalingrad for 58 days, a building that German maps identified as a fortress and that became known after the war as Pavlov's house, described the kind of combat Chuikov had designed in his memoir. We lived inside the walls of the building. We slept in the basements when we could sleep. We ate when something came from the other side of the river, which wasn't always. The Germans attacked 2 or 3 times a day, sometimes more. But we had made the building in a way that to enter they had to pass through fields of fire we controlled. We could move men from floor to floor without going outside. We had holes in the walls connecting the rooms, so we could attack from angles they didn't expect. We didn't win because we were better. We won because we knew every centimeter of that building, and they had to learn it under our fire. Pavlov's description captures the essence of what Chuikov had turned Stalingrad into. Not a defensive line, but a labyrinth of knowledge, where every square meter of terrain the defenders knew was a square meter that cost the attackers blood to learn. If this is giving you a different way to think about what urban combat actually looks like at its most extreme, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week at this level of detail. Back to the story. Chuikov's sniper program was one of the most deliberately calculated elements of his defensive strategy. In open terrain, a sniper is useful but not decisive. In Stalingrad's urban labyrinth, a sniper with a well-chosen position could paralyze German movement across an entire sector for days. Chuikov organized sniper training and deployment with the same systematic methodology he applied to assault groups. The best marksmen were identified in the units, equipped with available precision rifles, and assigned to positions covering the routes German infantry had to use to advance. The most famous of those snipers was Vasili Chuikov, the Siberian hunter who had grown up tracking game across the steppes and brought those skills to Stalingrad's rubble. Zaitsev killed more than 200 confirmed German soldiers during the battle, but his operational impact was larger than that number. He forced German commanders to divert resources and attention to counter-sniper operations, to move units with greater caution, to avoid certain open spaces that could have been more efficiently used for advance. The cumulative effect of assault groups, hugging tactics, snipers, bunkers in every basement, holes in every wall, was that the German rate of advance in Stalingrad measured in meters per day rather than kilometers. Every block the Germans took cost more than any prior analysis had projected. And every day that passed was a day Operation Uranus, the Soviet encirclement that Zhukov was planning on the steppes north and south of the city, came closer to execution. On November 19, 1942, while the 62nd Army continued its calculated agony in the ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviet Southwest Front attacked the northern flank of the German position. The following day, the Stalingrad Front attacked from the south. Operation Uranus, the encirclement Zhukov had designed. On November 23rd, the two arms of the encirclement met at Kalak. The German 6th Army, 300,000 men, was surrounded. Chuikov's defense had fulfilled its purpose, not by saving Stalingrad in the conventional sense, not by expelling the Germans or recovering lost territory, by doing something more valuable, keeping the 6th Army trapped in the city for the 2.5 months that Zhukov needed to prepare and execute the encirclement. Every day Chuikov survived was a day the Germans couldn't withdraw the 6th Army to defensive positions outside the city. Every German soldier consumed in the rubble of Stalingrad was a soldier who wasn't covering the vulnerable flanks on the steppes, where the weaker Romanian armies held the line. The Germans had taken nearly 90% of Stalingrad's urban area. They had reached the Volga in several sectors. They had taken the northern factories in fighting that destroyed entire divisions. And they were trapped. Chuikov had understood from the beginning. The objective of Stalingrad's defense was not to hold territory. It was to consume the Sixth Army, to turn the city into a bottomless pit that absorbed every reserve Paulus committed, making him progressively more vulnerable to the encirclement coming from the steppes. General Friedrich Paulus, captured after the surrender of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, described in his prisoner statements the moment he understood what Chuikov had been doing. "I understood too late that we were not fighting an army that was trying to survive. We were fighting an army that was trying to trap us. Every position we took cost us forces we couldn't replace. Every day inside the city was a day we didn't use to reinforce the flanks. When the encirclement came, it wasn't a tactical surprise. It was the consequence of a decision we had made weeks earlier without understanding what we were deciding." War correspondent Vasili Grossman, who covered Stalingrad for the Red Star newspaper and was present at Chuikov's command post during the most intense weeks of the battle, described the general with a frankness that official Soviet accounts rarely permitted. Chuikov at his command post on the Volga bank was the strangest image I had seen in this war. The river behind him, the city in flames ahead, and him studying his maps with the calm of someone solving a mathematics problem. His officers were afraid, not of the Germans, but of him. Because Chuikov didn't accept excuses, he only accepted results. And the results he demanded were impossible. And the men achieved them anyway because there was no alternative. I asked him once how it was possible to maintain the morale of an army dying at this rate. He told me that morale was not a feeling, it was a decision. And that he had decided that the 62nd Army would not die in Stalingrad. Grossman's account captures something that operational analysis can never measure: the role of a single commander's will in the collective resistance of a unit. Chuikov didn't have more resources than he had. What he had was certainty that the available resources were sufficient if used correctly, and the willingness to defend that certainty against all contrary evidence. Americans have a specific relationship with the Stalingrad story that's worth examining directly. The Battle of Stalingrad happened while American forces were fighting in North Africa, the same theater where the Germans and Italians Paulus needed reinforcements from were being tied down. The connection is direct. Every German division committed to Stalingrad was a division not available for North Africa. Every week Chuikov held the city was a week Rommel didn't get the reinforcements he needed. The parallel goes further. What Chuikov figured out at Stalingrad, that the defender can neutralize a technologically superior attacker by eliminating the space the technology requires to function, is the same lesson that American forces learned in later urban battles. In Hue in 1968, in Fallujah in 2004, in Mosul in 2017. The specific details change, the structural dynamic doesn't. A defender who knows the terrain and is willing to fight at zero distance from the attacker forces the attacker to fight at his worst, not his best. Chuikov was the first commander in the industrial age to systematize that insight into an operational doctrine. Every American officer who has studied urban combat has studied what Chuikov did at Stalingrad. Most of them don't know his name. Vasili Chuikov survived Stalingrad, continued commanding the 62nd Army, redesignated the 8th Guards Army, through the entire campaign that followed the encirclement, and arrived in Berlin in 1945 as one of the most decorated generals in the Soviet Union. He wrote his memoirs in the 1960s with an honesty that the constraints of Soviet historiography rarely permitted. He acknowledged the catastrophic losses of the 62nd Army, the mistakes he made, the days when the position seemed untenable. And he explained, with the clarity of someone who had lived it, why he made the decisions he did. The lesson of Chuikov is not about heroism, though the heroism was real and cost real lives at a rate that the numbers can't fully capture. It's about a rare capacity to see the problem from an angle nobody else has considered when all the conventional answers have failed. In September 1942, the conventional answer to the 62nd Army situation was impossible. There was no way to defend Stalingrad conventionally with the available resources. The numbers didn't work. The geography didn't help. German superiority was too real to ignore. Chuikov didn't ignore that superiority. He used it. He transformed German air superiority into a vulnerability. Because zero distance made it impossible to use. He transformed German armor superiority into irrelevance, because tanks can't maneuver in a rubble labyrinth. He transformed German fire superiority into a bidirectional tool, because at 10 meters distance, German fire killed Germans as efficiently as it killed Soviets. What he did was change the problem. Not the problem of how to defend Stalingrad with insufficient resources. That problem had no solution. But the problem of how to use Stalingrad to destroy the 6th German Army with the resources he had. That problem had a solution. The solution was to get closer to the enemy instead of pulling back. It's a logic that applies well beyond the military context. When resources are insufficient to solve a problem conventionally, the right question isn't how to get more resources. It's whether the problem is being correctly defined. Whether the distance assumed to be necessary is actually necessary. Whether the adversary's advantage can be converted into a liability by changing the terrain of the engagement. Chuikov changed the terrain, literally. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, that change cost 300,000 German lives and saved the Soviet Union.